Hi guys, I'm Gaspachian. I saw this week's Reddit challenge was to go into orbit, retrieve some scraps up there, and return them safely to clean up LKO and preferably keep us from having some sort of resonance cascade here or whatever. No, the other kind of cascade. Resonance Cascade, that's a different game altogether. Anyways, we are bringing up this this fancy shuttle. It's got a fairly hefty booster here. The challenge said no part mods or anything, so like the only thing we're using here is of course stock, and we're using tanks here from Making History. I'm just adjusting the brightness here so you can see a little bit better what's going on. We're using the 5-meter parts from Making History, but only the tanks, right? And if you look at the end of that shuttle there, you can also see we're using one of those new tube parts, but that's mostly just for looks. So yeah, you could build this craft in stock. You would have to redesign the launcher to use like 3.75 meter tanks, and it wouldn't look as nice. So it's mostly just aesthetics that we're bringing in from the DLC. We're going to launch this into an equatorial orbit. I have chosen to place all the parts into an equatorial orbit. They are in different orbits, different altitudes, and of course different phases because of that. But they are all in the same inclination. So we're going matching inclination with one of them here is going to match inclination with the rest as well. That's just to make the challenge a bit more manageable, because we have a lot of engineering difficulties to overcome, even without that. Or rather, even with that restriction on their orbits. We have to design a craft to bring everything down safely. We have to consider all of that. We could do some hacky stuff and just like get a big claw tree, I guess. Just a craft that's all a bunch of claws branched out, and then have some parachutes with that and bring them down gently through the atmosphere. The parts we're bringing down with us are not very dense, so they should survive re-entry somewhat neatly. We opt to, of course, dump the fuel tank there before reaching our apoapse, is what it's called, yeah, as to not increase the amount of junk in low carbon orbit. But yeah, bringing them down unshielded wouldn't be a problem, really. And as you can see, like the tank there for the booster is totally surviving re-entry here, because it's coming down very shallow, and as long as your density is low enough, you should be able to survive that. Well, at least if you'll nail the landing better than the booster did there. So we perform our apogee kick. We are now in a stable orbit. We also managed to combine that maneuver with the plane change required to get us coplanar with all these debris pieces. And we're setting us up here for oscillating orbits. What that means is that either of your apses are pretty much aligned with one of the target apses, and that means you can get a encounter that is entirely pro or retrograde, meaning you don't have to adjust for any radial velocity differences when you actually rendezvous. I've been staring at the word render way too much for the past couple of hours trying to put this video together. Anyways, doing that means we can save a lot of delta V, and the delta V requirements, well, rather the delta V budget we have set for ourselves here is kind of narrow. We opted to bring just a bit of fuel here with us, and you'll see why in a moment. Well, it's actually quite a lot of fuel, but it turns out we're very heavy, and there may be a reason for that, but you'll see that later in the video. So anyways, we time warp, because setting up this encounter doesn't necessarily mean we get a quick encounter, but we get an encounter eventually, and an encounter with a very low relative velocity. And you want a low relative velocity, because that means you have to cancel out very little of your relative velocity. You can see we're using a very weak engine here as well, but that's all you need once you're up in orbit, really. Like, you won't be having much gravity losses here, you won't have steering losses, as long as you can perform your node within a minute or so. Like, there's really no cost to having this weaker engine, so to say. So you want to bring along as small engines as possible, really, as your patience allows, so that your mass ratio gets better. And you would see that on our delta V readouts if we had any on screen, or in the game at all for that matter, because we're playing entirely without mods, which didn't really help the engineering challenges behind this. Well, I knew which mission stretches to optimize and which to just overdo. For example, the booster we saw earlier can totally lift another 20 or so tons, I believe. But now we're sort of in the regime where we have to be careful. So you can see us being very gentle here as we try to grab the engine. If you look at our monopropellant resource loadout, for example, we only have about 300 monoprop available to us. So we're being very careful as to not do a mistake here. We grab it without any issues. What you do to really improve your fuel economy when it comes to RCS fuel is you disable pitch, yaw and roll control in the actuation toggles for your RCS, because the stock SAS will never try to use your translational controls, let's say. It will only use your rotational controls, and it's not very sparing in doing so. So we set up the next encounter, we get the next part. If you've seen one, you've seen them all, basically. We had some issues trying to get some parts. For instance, this doesn't have a collider down in the bottom, or rather down the middle, which is where the center mass is, so lining that up was a bit of a hassle. Fuel tank is big and flat, so that was easy. And where to put this SRB, well, that was quite a question, so we have it sticking out like that out of the payload doors. So maybe that will destabilize us during descent. We're about to find out. Anyways, this was a pretty hard descent. We're very heavy. We have those payload doors being less than cooperative with our airflow, let's say. What you saw me doing earlier there was setting up a node so we could be angled correctly once we actually get to atmospheric interface, so we don't have to do that last minute. We are coming down. We have set up our control surfaces in such a way that they keep us fairly stable throughout the descent, but as you can see, we're just falling like a rock. We're burning this fuel, leaving this pretty trail behind us, and yeah, you can see the deflection we're seeing. We're not falling with style even, we're just plummeting. So the obvious disclaimer is that, well, I didn't land this landing the first attempt. This is probably the most unaerodynamic thing I've ever tried to land on the runway. After a few attempts I realized, well, I can close those front bay doors, they aren't obstructed by anything. And by doing so I gained a little bit of glide extra, and that was able to keep us in the air long enough to flatten out our approach, enough that it didn't just break the plane apart. Well guys, that was a successful mission. We got up into orbit using our fancy space shuttle. We retrieved all 4 parts. We had to perform kind of a hacky landing due to them not fitting in the cargo bay, but finally we have cleared low carbon orbit from debris. Well, people never learn, do they? Someone put up some more debris here. Looks like about the same amount as last time. But obviously, yeah. We're going to have to do something about that, won't we? So for you who figured that out early on, congratulations. But yeah, we have an SSTO, and we're going to do the same thing once again. Our ground crew is only going to remove the OMS we used for the shuttle part of this mission, and then it's off to do once more the very same thing. Hard mode ×2, let's go.